Imagine sitting in a dark theater, the lights dimming, and the first words flashing across the screen based on a true story. Instantly, your heart rate jumps because you know what you're about to see isn't just entertainment, it actually happened. Hollywood has a way of dramatizing, twisting, and amplifying real-life events, but some of the most chilling and gripping crime films ever made trace their roots back to real cases. Tonight, let's step into the shadows where true crime and Hollywood collide and uncover the stories that inspired blockbuster movies. One of the most famous cases that Hollywood couldn't resist retelling is the chilling saga of Ed Gein. On the surface, he was just a quiet man from Plainfield, Wisconsin, living on a lonely farm. But when police finally investigated him in 1957, they discovered horrors straight out of a nightmare. Human body parts turned into household objects, skin stitched into clothing, and a macabre obsession with the dead. Ed Gein's crimes shocked America, and while he wasn't a prolific serial killer, the grotesque details of his life became the blueprint for some of Hollywood's darkest characters. Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs all owe their twisted origins to Gein's farm of horrors. What Gein did blurred the line between crime and pure madness, and Hollywood never forgot. Then there's the terrifying tale of the Zodiac Killer, a name that still sends chills down the spines of Californians. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Zodiac taunted police and newspapers with cryptic letters, coded messages, and threats. He claimed to have killed dozens, though only a handful of victims were confirmed. The chilling mystery wasn't just about the murders, but about the killer's obsession with publicity, his puzzles that remain unsolved to this day, and the fact that he was never caught. Hollywood adapted this story in films like Zodiac, 2007, capturing the frustration of detectives and journalists who spent decades chasing shadows. The scariest part? Somewhere, the Zodiac could still be alive, his identity buried in silence. Another crime that found its way onto the silver screen was the infamous Foxcatcher case. John DuPont, a wealthy heir to one of America's richest families, seemed to live a life of privilege and eccentricity. But beneath the wealth was paranoia and instability. DuPont became obsessed with wrestling and built a massive training facility for Olympic athletes on his estate. For years, he sponsored athletes and tried to insert himself into their lives, but his mental state grew increasingly erratic. In 1996, he shocked the sports world when he murdered Olympic gold medalist Dave Schultz. The tragedy inspired the film Foxcatcher, 2014, showing how power, money, and unchecked mental illness spiraled into violence. Let's not forget the haunting story of Heavenly Creatures, 1994. Based on real events in New Zealand, the film tells the tale of two teenage girls, Pauline Parker and Juliet Holm, who developed an intense, almost obsessive friendship in the 1950s. When their parents tried to separate them, the girls conspired in a shocking act of violence, murdering Pauline's mother with a brick in a park. What makes this case so disturbing is how young they were, barely teenagers, and how the line between fantasy and reality blurred for them. The film captured the psychological complexity of their relationship, reminding audiences that not all crimes are committed by hardened adults. Sometimes they're born from youthful obsession and desperation. And then there's Catch Me If You Can, 2002, a film that feels almost too outrageous to be true. Yet the story of Frank Abagnale Jr. is entirely real. By the age of 21, Frank had posed as a Pan Am pilot, a doctor, and a lawyer, all while forging checks worth millions of dollars. He was charming, clever, and fearless, outsmarting banks and the FBI alike. His story might not be drenched in blood and horror like others, but it shows another side of true crime, the thrill of the con. Hollywood turned it into a stylish cat-and-mouse chase, with Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks bringing the real-life chase to life. Unlike many stories here, this one ends with redemption. Abagnale eventually worked with the FBI to help catch other fraudsters. Another deeply disturbing story is that of Monster, 2003, inspired by the life of Eileen Wuornos. A sex worker in Florida during the late 1980s and early 1990s, Wuornos murdered 7 men, claiming self-defense against assault. Her troubled childhood, years of abuse, and descent into crime made her story both tragic and terrifying. Charlize Theron's portrayal of Wuornos earned her an Academy Award, but more importantly, it forced audiences to confront the humanity and horror within one of America's most notorious female serial killers. Hollywood also drew from the chilling Amityville horror case. In 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered his entire family in their Long Island home. Just a year later, the Lutz family moved in and claimed to experience terrifying paranormal events, voices, moving objects, and ghostly figures. Whether you believe the supernatural angle or not, the real crime, the massacre of 6 family members, was more horrifying than anything the movies could create. The Amityville case spawned countless films, books, and documentaries, proving how one crime can transform into legend. But not all Hollywood-inspired crimes are old. Take The Bling Ring, 2013, a film based on a group of teenagers in Los Angeles who burglarized celebrity homes in the late 2000s. Obsessed with fame and luxury, they broke into the houses of stars like Paris Hilton, Lindsay Lohan, and Orlando Bloom, stealing millions in cash, clothes, and jewelry. While it sounds glamorous, the reality was a bunch of reckless teens seduced by wealth and attention. The film highlighted how modern obsessions, social media, fame, and materialism can fuel criminal behavior. What's fascinating about all these cases is how Hollywood picks and chooses what to show. Sometimes it exaggerates details, sometimes it tones them down. But the truth behind the movies is often darker, stranger, and more unsettling than fiction. Watching these films feels thrilling, but remembering that they're rooted in reality makes them haunting. When you see those words, based on a true story, you're not just watching entertainment. You're looking at the retelling of real lives, real crimes, and real tragedies. Behind every blockbuster, there are victims, investigators, and families who lived through the nightmare. That's why these stories never lose their grip on us. They remind us that truth is often scarier than fiction. So, the next time you sit down for a Hollywood crime thriller, remember, somewhere in the shadows, someone once lived this story. And for better or worse, Hollywood has made sure their crimes will never be forgotten.